I felt as though a lot of the information I took away from these couple chapters of reading really put a little bit more into perspective the aforementioned material from the previous readings. A couple of the main ideas that were mentioned in these chapters from 7 to 11 happened to be the comparison of agricultural practices in between the US and Spain. Barber goes on to mention in the beginning of chapter 7 how he was looking over this landscape within Spain and how there was so many different pieces of agriculture, where it be the growing of grains and vegetables and just animals grazing, that were all kind of coexisting, whereas in comparison to the US, the agriculture system is really divided into different areas, and they're large productions of very specific crops. They're not these small farms that are growing crops in addition to raising animals for meat and or dairy products. They're just simply just for grain, just for dairy, just for meat. And they're very specific areas within the country. And they don't coexist in the same fashion. Moving forward, he goes on to talk about a chef, which he mentions a lot within this chapter, whose name was Jean-Louis Paladin. And he talks a lot about his practices and kind of how he brought forth that farm to table type of sense prior to this really being a big trend, so to speak. He kind of broke the mold when it comes to, I guess you can say, the expectations. He celebrated a lot of American products, whereas being a French chef, typically that's not what you were seeing. They were having a lot of French chefs saying that American products are basically subpar. But he also took a lot of parts of animals that typically were not used and used them to enhance the dishes that he was making. In a better sense, he was using much more of the animals instead of disposing of them. And this is kind of a standard that you weren't seeing amongst a lot of other people. Another name that was mentioned a lot was Eduardo Souza, who was the man who was raising geese for the foie gras that was not force-fed. Barber goes out to see this man and discusses his practices and how his geese are fed or lack thereof, and how he raises these geese in such an organic manner. And he talks about how the way Eduardo Souza chooses to raise his geese affects the quality of his product that he's putting forth. The last major topic that was covered, when Barber goes into the production of chicken, he talks about how he starts looking at this spreadsheet and kind of goes down this rabbit hole about how the profit margins are when it comes to raising chickens, and how easy it was to kind of fall forth into the mindset of how can we make the most profit and kind of dismiss all the other factors going into the chicken production. He then, in the end of the chapter, talks about how this cycle that the US has gotten into has kind of made for a cycle that's hard to get out of now. That being said, I feel like this really ties into the food sovereignty piece that was mentioned in the additional readings, both the article where they interviewed Leah Penniman and also the article written by Nina Sevilla. I feel like the US has a really compromised food sovereignty, based on the get bigger, get out type of model that was mentioned in Barber's book. And this is where I feel like a lot of the information presented in previous chapters really started to click for me in talking about how the industrialization of our food system has really compromised that food sovereignty, because so many of these big corporations control so much of how our food is produced here in this country that it compromises our ability to have access to foods. And we've gotten into a food system that's on such a cycle that now it's hard to step back from that system and reassess. In addition, my biggest takeaways actually in these readings was kind of just how eye-opening even some minor statements were in the readings. So on page 208, they had talked about how when Perdue started selling chickens versus whole chickens, they started breaking them off into pieces. This also came, as the industrialization kind of kept moving forward and we saw more women in the workplace. This became more of a convenience thing, and it snowballed and has since continued to snowball. Furthermore, I feel like there's so many facets that feed into our food systems and how industrialization has changed that. And I think all the information that is being presented and has been in these past couple chapters has really been eye-opening to see. They had talked about how the overproduction of chicken and the overproduction of grain is kind of feeding into each systems, how overproduction of grain is being fed to chickens and animals, and overproduction of chickens is being sent off to different areas in the world and used as fish foods. Again, kind of just elaborating on that snowball effect that our food system here in the US has.